I just want to share some of our work that we're doing from a culture perspective and try and position where leadership fits into the space. The model that we're using from a Western Cape government perspective is the one reflected on the screen, which has really got 3 core elements to it. It works on the basis that the most fundamental layer of culture is what we refer to as assumptions and beliefs. And that feeds into what is referred to as espoused values and ultimately gets reflected at the top layer, which is called artifacts, but that's what people physically see and experience on a daily basis. And in order to shift culture, it's critical that you work at the lowest level, the deepest level, which is the assumption and beliefs level, and that you align the other elements as you're going along. And that's why our values-based leadership development program is specifically geared to work with these, let's call it these deep held beliefs that ultimately drive behavior. Now, all of you have heard about the new way of work. It's just important to once again put this in the context of what we're talking about today, because this is really essentially the challenges that leaders like you and me need to support in the current times. And what we're trying to instill and embed in the Western Cape government are the following things: to move towards a state where citizen centricity is top of mind for every person that works in the Western Cape government. That we break down the silos between national, local, and provincial government, and also between departments, and that we act as one government. That we collaborate across these different spheres and departments in a seamless manner. That people and our systems that we've got are truly adaptive and adaptable, and that we innovate to find new ways to deal with the new issues and challenges that we are faced. Obviously, in order to do that, people need to think differently, and also to innovate. Courage is quite a key element that needs to be instilled and embedded. And lastly, a massive element that needs to be dealt with is the ease of doing business. That every citizen, when they engage government, they actually feel that it's easy to transact and to deal with government, and that they're not stuck in red tape and bureaucracy. Let me just move my slide. These are some of the core behaviors that we're trying to embed as far from a cultural perspective in order to shift towards the new way of work, and that we've got in our culture journey and Western Cape government culture plan. You'll see it on the left and the right-hand side here. Obviously, our values are paramount to all of this, and that sort of encapsulates everything that we do and how we need to approach this. But we're going to focus specifically on the elements, as I said, that's shared on the left and right: adaptability, innovation, data intelligence, sense making, and also the factors on the right-hand side that I can't see that clearly given the fact that my screen doesn't show it at this point in time. But those other 3 elements on the right-hand side as well. The center of this is obviously jobs, safety, and well-being. That's why we're doing this. It's the recovery plan, and the reason why we're wanting to embed these core behaviors in our cultures is because we believe it's fundamental to help us to shift and get those recovery plan objectives implemented. And also our values-based leadership need to contain this. As I said, leadership being a fundamental enabler for culture. It's vital that that our values-based leadership also exhibits that and ultimately help to embed those behaviors. Just the last slide before I hand over to our presenters. I think it's important to note that the landscape, the leadership landscape, has shifted quite a bit. And there's a variety of factors that leaders today need to deal with that possibly they didn't need to deal with, let's say, a year, 6 months, or sometimes even as yesterday. But social unrest is something that we see is a reality in our lives. Fear and anxiety in terms of what is the next crisis. A lot of people know that COVID, I think they thought might be with us for 6 months or possibly a year. And what's the next thing? When COVID eventually dies away, what's the next crisis? And that's type of the fears and anxiety that sits in the system that leaders need to deal with personally, but also deal with regards to their people. Citizen demands increase as a result of all these factors that sit out there. We see it in our country today. There's geopolitical instability that has an impact on us as a system and as a country. Economic volatility and challenges, unprecedented climate events that people foresee and that they expect, and nobody knows when that will happen. In and out groups in our country due to the inequality and also the tensions that create in the workplace. Erosion of trust in institutions, changing values as a result of all these fundamental shifts. And then lastly, just the old recipes that we used to sort of apply to deal with these challenges doesn't seem to be that effective anymore. So I think that the key thing here, the positive out of all of this is, where there's disruption, there's opportunity. The fact that we can work together to actually address some of these risks and create a better future for all. So that's the opportunity. So even though things feel really disruptive, there is an opportunity to make things better. The ask, however, of leaders is that we need to show up differently to hold the space required to actually get this affected. And that's really, I think, just an intro to what we're going to deal with today. You would have seen the invite called Leadership Maturity Fundamentals 101. So the aim is really to give you a high-level feel for this and hopefully create excitement to delve into this space a bit more. So introducing today's speakers, Lucille Greeff. Lucille is a director at Aephoria. Lucille is an industrial psychologist. And she's in the business of really improving organizations and working with leaders to improve organizations. Simon is managing director of Aephoria. And he's got a passion for leadership maturity and working with organizations to actually look at ways to improve leadership maturity. I think Aephoria has also designed a tool called the Leadership Maturity Assessment, which is a unique tool. And that actually all of this work that they're going to share with you today is also premised on. So I think without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Simon. So Simon, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Johan. And thank you to the 294 people who are joining us this morning, apparently a record for a webinar at Western Cape Government. So that's quite thrilling to be here. We're just going to share our screen now. We're actually running two laptops, so it's a bit like mission control in here. We've got the chat and the share on one, and then we've got the actual audio and video on another. So we will be looking from time to time left and right. Okay.
Great. It's really lovely to have all of you here. And I think it's such an auspicious time. And Johan, thanks so much for the introduction to this current context. I think we're very aware of the fact that in the Western Cape right now, I think we are quite privileged to not be in the same position as a lot of our colleagues and fellow citizens in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng are in particular. So just to also note that we're having this conversation at a time that's very critical for our country, and we want to acknowledge that up front.
Okay, so a little bit of a health warning to start with. This work is likely to mess with your brains just a little bit. So we want to put that up front and say, just be ready for a little bit of sense-making turbulence as we go through this. We're going to challenge your worldview a little bit. That's what this work can do. And that's what this time actually has been doing as well, is really challenging us in the last 18 months or so around how we engage with the world, how we engage with ourselves and with others. And we just want to check in around that to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are going to run a poll, which will be coming up on your screens in a moment. Let me just stop the share here for a second. And we're going to ask you to answer just two questions. The first question, you can choose multiple answers. There, you don't only have to choose one around the anxiety, confusion, etc. The second question, you have one answer to give. And we're asking you to just add a couple of answers there. We'll just take a minute or two to do so. Happening quite quickly there. Yeah. Thanks. We've had about 70, 80 people already answering, so we'll just keep this open for the next 30 seconds. So we're in the territory of speaking about maturity. And as we sit here and as people still answering the questions, you can ask yourself, what does maturity mean to me? What's my definition of maturity? And in the next 10, 20 seconds, we'll close the poll and show you some of the results to see where things are at in this group. Last couple of answers coming in.
Up to about 150 participants now in the poll.
260. Great. Okay, so I am, even if you haven't responded, I'm going to just end the polling and share the results. There we go. So let me also just pull this up so you can see all the different results there. So if we look at what people have experienced at work in the last month, a lot of exhaustion. 61% of you have felt tired and exhausted. And I think that's part of the context we speak into, and important to just acknowledge that. Almost 60% of you have felt anxious. 1 in 5 have experienced grief at work. And we are in the 3rd wave of COVID at the moment. And we want to just acknowledge that that's part of the landscape. And half of you are feeling there's more that's being demanded of me than I have to give, stretched beyond capacity. Wow, what a context that we're in. If we then look at our experience of leadership since the pandemic, only about 10% of you feel that it's been easier. More than 70% of you feel that it's been harder.
I'd love some tips from that 12% there around how it's been easier during the pandemic. I think that's quite interesting, and I haven't heard that much actually. So I'd be interested in knowing more about that at some point.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the results and get us back to our presentation. And Simon?
Yep.
I have to plug in my computer.
Okay, you do that, and I will speak to the agenda. Okay, so we're going to move really fast today. We've got a lot to share. We've got limited time. Generally, in a leadership program, we would spend 3 days unpacking this framework, and we have about an hour and a bit. So we're going to get into just thinking about what is maturity. What does it mean in the context of leadership? We're then going to share some theory, so the model, and just take a quick view of the framework. Again, we'll go through that very quickly, just to give you a sense of what that looks like. Then we want to spend a bit more time on what that means in practice. So that's all well and good to have a framework, but how does that show up in the world? How does that show up in our lives? How does it help us? You know, ask the question, so what? And then some practical stuff around how to mature people and organizations, and a call to action actually around every individual on this call today. And then we'll have, hopefully, a little bit of time for questions at the end. Okay, so just turn to the chat and pop in there what comes into your head when we ask this question. So in the context of leadership specifically, what is maturity? What does it mean to you? How do you spot it when it's in your orbit? What do mature people look like? What do mature leaders look like? Just put in. Okay, emotional intelligence, consistency, very interesting. Growth in response. Okay, in control of emotions, that's an interesting one, the word control with emotions. Yeah, EQ again, empathy, beautiful.
knowing the difference between management and leadership. Interesting one. We've got lots of EQ, empathy, compassion coming through. And maybe we're particularly aware of that given the questions we asked in the poll a moment ago. So navigating difficult times. It's values-based. We control ego issues. It's about objectivity. Lots of answers coming through. Servanthood.
Capacity for complexity. I like that one. We're going to speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, so keep it coming as we will continue the conversation. One of the things that you might want to ask yourself is, can I challenge my definition of maturity given what I'm learning here?
So we asked the question up front, why bother with this at all? We are, as Johan said, very passionate about maturity. I would say bordering on obsessed at times, because we think that this is the game changer. This is the game changer around leadership, around organizations, and possibly globally to address some of the challenges that the world faces. We think that because we firmly believe that adding to your toolkit is all well and good. Learning new skills is all well and good, but actually what we really need to do is examine the person who is implementing the toolkit, which is ourselves. So we've got to be working on ourselves now in order to navigate the world that we find ourselves in. Happily, there are a lot of benefits around this. And what we know from research and from our own work over the last 15, 20 years or so is that organizations who focus on maturity are more agile, are more strategic, are more collaborative. And these are all things that the Western Cape government has explicitly said that you want to generate within your organization. And then finally, this work opens up unbelievable new windows for transformation for you. However you engage with it, however long you engage with it, and that includes the 90 minutes that we've got today. So just be open to what comes in the next little while.
Maybe another way of saying this in some kind of ways, as the world continues to become more complex and hard to make sense of, as the demands on us continue to increase, what we need to do is we need to find ways of increasing our capacity as leaders. And that's what we call vertical development or maturation from a leadership development perspective.
And just to touch very briefly and quite generically around where this has been used, it's being used globally across governments on many continents. So the US has adopted this very, very closely and has rolled it out around federal government, state government, and specifically in places like Department of Defense, as has the Singaporean government in New Zealand, UK as well, both centrally and local government across the UK. And then in South Africa, so City of Cape Town and yourselves, and now the MPA as well, is adopting leadership maturity as a fundamental way of developing the organization and the people in it. And we're also working with a number of state-owned enterprises across South Africa. So this has been adopted globally. It is a recognized technology for maturing systems and for maturing individuals. So we just wanted to let you know that.
So Haroon, seeing your question around just expanding a bit more on vertical development, we're going to use an analogy in a moment or so around a mountain. And when we get to the mountain part, maybe the vertical development will make more sense for you. So just hang on to your hat for a moment. We're getting there. So one way of thinking about this idea of maturity, and here we have two pictures of Dubai. The one Dubai only 40 years ago and Dubai today. When we are implementing certain strategies and solutions, for example, we are implementing ideas of becoming more agile in our department. Sometimes when we make these decisions where we say, this is the strategy we're going to follow, this is what we're going to implement here, we're implementing it with this idea of almost the ideal environment that we're in. Maybe we think we're in Dubai in modern times. But if we really look at what's going on in our directorate or in our department, what we find is that actually we don't have all that infrastructure, we don't have the mindsets that are required for that yet. We actually in Dubai 40 years ago, and we are needing to do some groundwork. And a lot of that groundwork is not just developing the technical skills for things, but also the right mindsets and beliefs that we need to implement this. Now, of course, we're not trying to be Dubai. This is not what we're suggesting. We're using these pictures to give you an idea of the gap that sometimes exists between what we think is possible and where we are at in reality. This idea that we think that we can just say, let's implement Agile, and then it will stick. But because people's mindsets aren't there yet, we need to first do some other developmental work, and maturation is often part of the developmental work that allows something like Agile or transversal collaboration to stick. Another way of thinking about this is to look at the nature of the world right now. Most of you are familiar with the term VUCA. It's a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, and we're experiencing it all the time. In updating some of this framework and thinking, we are also referring these days to the nature of systems and the nature of the world today as being more in a Banny world. And the Banny world is the world that is brittle. What do we know about brittle things like peanut brittle? Brittle things break. And I think the last couple of days in our country have shown us how close to that point of brittleness we're at. It's not just volatility, it's things are actually breaking and being broken. And what that brings up for us, if we think about what you all said, is that leaders have to cope with things like anxiety a lot more than in the past, even than 3 years ago before the pandemic. And we know that many of you said that you've experienced anxiety. Up to 60% have experienced anxiety at the work, and exhaustion, and some other really complex emotions. And a lot of these things are non-linear. It's not just complex. It's like we can't figure out how the parts connect, because through social medias, through social networks, through the multiple connections into complex issues such as health and well-being and poverty. How do we fix poverty? It's something that has so many components to it that it's really tricky to figure out where to start. And so in part, the world is becoming incomprehensible.
Just want to pick up on Leslie's point there. How should values-based leadership be aligned with political context and current unrest? And I love that you brought in context, and it is so often ignored. We make an assumption sometimes that we lead in a vacuum, and of course we don't. We are buffeted around by the context all the time. And so we absolutely have to work actively with it. And that's what this work enables us to do. Actually, the more that we grow and develop and mature, the more we bring context into the ways that we engage with the world. Absolutely, Simon.
So some of the people on this call are currently part of the pilot of the Western Cape Government Values-based Leadership Development Program. Some of you may have heard of it from your team members. Some of you may be interested in joining this. We'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of this. But what we are doing with the Values-based Leadership Development Program is a maturation journey with many different components to that. And as you learn more about maturity, know that if this is a journey that you want to go on for yourself, there are things you can do informally to support your own maturation. And you can also sign up for the Values-based Leadership Program as a more formal way of getting into the heat or the frying pan, so to speak.
Okay, good. We're going to take just probably 15, 20 minutes or so to go through what is quite a complex and layered model. So we're going to move fast. You will have probably plenty of questions after this. We're just going to take you through the framework now briefly. And start with this. So we said that we were going to mess with your worldview a little bit. And here's one of those points in the presentation. So we believe, we know that humans construct their own reality. So stuff happens in the world, but the way that we process it, make sense of it, and tell a story around it and have a narrative around it is our inner world stuff, our inner world processes. And we do that through a number of different lenses through which we see the world. So absolutely our age, our upbringing, our gender, our race, our personality, our beliefs, our values, all of these things are lenses on the world. And they help us to make sense of what's going on in the world. Maturity is a big, big part of this. So our development, growth, and worldview leads us to make sense of what's happening in the world in a particular way and construct a particular reality. And that's what we're going to focus on a bit more now.
Yeah.
And we really believe that maturity is a, if not the critical lens, how we make sense of the world. Mm. And the analogy that Lucille alluded to actually is this notion of a mountain. And so what we say is the higher up the mountain we are, the further we can see. And so as we grow and develop, we can see more of ourselves, more of the world, more of others, the good, the bad, the indifferent, different types of information, not just rational information, but emotional information. And we can build a much more complex picture of what's going on simply because we can see more. I'm loving the additions of the lenses, absolutely, class, disability. We could go on and on around this. And I think they're great builds to really make the same point, which is we make our reality through a series of very, very complex lenses. There are many, many of them.
So the idea of maturity is really to do the kind of development work that helps us to climb higher and higher in the mountain. And that is why it's called vertical development. The higher up in the mountain we are, the more we can see.
I'm just liking that point there.
Yeah.
So the photo's great. The challenge is that sometimes those at the top cannot see the bottom when the mist sets in.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. This happens. And here for a moment, part of what we'd like to invite you to think about in terms of the mountain, though, is in maturity terms, the people at the top of the mountain may or may not be the people at the top of the hierarchy of the organization. So you might have people that can see quite a lot of what's going on because from a maturity perspective, they've developed the capacity to integrate a lot of information that others discard or don't even recognize and see. And so they might be in the hierarchy in the middle of the organization. So sometimes some of the perspectives around maturity, it's just important to separate them out from the organization design and yes, the levels in the org design.
And just to add to that, as we go on to the model and we get our first look of it, when we mature and we grow to later stages of maturity, we take with us the capacity to access earlier levels. So we don't lose our connection with those other worldviews. And so absolutely, that's a valid challenge around those at the top not being able to see those at the bottom. But I think that as we grow and develop, we retain the capacity to speak to all levels of maturity. So that's an important point just to underline here. First look at the model. So we can see that there are 8 stages of development according to the identity maturation framework. And they're split broadly into conventional levels, what we call conventional levels, and post-conventional levels. We're going to look at each one of these very quickly in the slides that are coming up. But just to get a sense of where the numbers sit, for example. So 80% of people, according to research, sit in conventional levels of maturity, and less than 20% make it into post-conventional levels. So that's a massive opportunity as far as we're concerned. So if we think the finishing line is conventional levels of maturity, what this model shows us is that we have so much more capacity to grow and develop. So that's the first point. The second point is that I want to just make the point here around later is not necessarily better. So whilst this is a stage model, it is vertical in its orientation. It doesn't mean that getting to later stages of maturity is better for everything. Actually, we need, and organizations need, people at all levels of development. So just we bear that in mind as we go through each stage.
And there we have, from some of the research that Simon was referencing, just a sense of how globally we are distributed across the different stages. So a huge chunk of us come in at the specializing and performing stages. Important to just note that this research was done pre-pandemic, and the pandemic has done two things. The pandemic has created opportunities for us to mature as we have to come to grips with a more complex reality, and we have to manage more complexity than we had to before. And at the same time, it's created something called fallback or regression, where because we are exhausted and tired and anxious and burnt out, and we're not taking care of ourselves, the context is acting like gravity and pulling us into earlier stages more often. So the pandemic has both created opportunities to mature and has in some way created some fallback or regression.
Okay, so we're going to go through each stage very briefly of the model. And my advice would be to just kind of let this information sink in, as opposed to try and remember every single piece of information that's on a slide. We're certainly not going to read through everything. We just want to give you a feel for each stage. And you will find also that this stuff is quite intuitive. So many of these characteristics that we're going to share now, you'll probably have an innate feel for them and where you've seen them before and where you've seen them in yourself as well. So the first stage is called self-protecting. Roughly 5% of adults are sitting here. So most people move beyond this stage. This stage is all about immediate needs, meeting my immediate needs today. So it's not about tomorrow. It's not about relationships tomorrow. It is about, what do I need today? Eat the sweets now. So we take opportunities, we take gaps at this level of development. It's a very short-term mindset. And as I say, about 5% of organizations will sit here. What does this look like in practice? Well, there's a picture in the top left-hand corner there of a woman called Anna Nicole Smith, who at the age of 20-something, I believe, married the multi-billionaire J. Howard Marshall, I think his name was, while he was on his deathbed, and inherited all of his money. So there's a beautiful case of opportunism in action. See a gap, meet my needs today, take the gap. I think another thing that we're faced with at the moment, and we've seen this across many countries, and we're seeing it maybe a little bit here at the moment, is exactly that thing. So what do I need today? And actions then that come from that belief that I must take this gap. And we've seen it in the UK with violence in the streets and in our soccer stadia, even at the weekend. We've seen it in the US in the Capitol building. We're seeing it now in parts of South Africa, sadly, where it is about just, what do I need today?
And let's not think about the consequences of our actions too much. I mean, I was struck yesterday with some footage in one of the news programs of someone in his security guard uniform without a mask, proudly showing what he looted. And so that thing of like, I'm not thinking of the consequences. It's all about eating the sweets now. Now, to understand people who get stuck here, we all have moments of opportunism. There's a fluidity of the stages in many ways, but people who get stuck here for a long time in the organization, I think it's important to know that most all of them are stuck there because of severe trauma in their upbringing. It's not that people have chosen not to develop beyond this. It's that trauma is keeping us stuck. It's also quite interesting to just use something like away without permission statistics in the organization to understand this self-protecting phase. So people who just stay away on the Monday after payday without having applied for leave, that kind of statistic, or the absence from work when an important sports event happens without permission. That gives you a sense of how much of your people in your department or team might be stuck here in a fairly permanent way.
The move to the next level comes about where we realize that actually this is not sustainable. We live with other people. We live in a system. We live and we are social animals. And so this idea of meeting my own needs on a daily basis is not sustainable in the world that we live in. And so people mature to the next stage that we call conforming. This is characterized by diplomacy and fitting in. Do you want to keep going on the chat? Or
yes, I'll just go on the chat for now.
All right, cool. So this is where people are most getting their identity from the group. It's about fitting in, it's about not sticking out, it's about getting along, and you recognize these people because there is a niceness around the conforming stage. There is empathy, there's reliability, there's consistency within the group. And so there's very much a kind of feeling of in-group and out-group here. So if you look like me, you sound like me, we go to the same places, we support the same soccer team, then we're the in-group. And anyone else who doesn't do that is in the out group. So difference at this point is a threat. I think that soccer fans are one of the greatest kind of visions of diplomacy and conforming. So, and I'm sort of cast my mind back to Sunday and watching my country folk, in fact, my English fans, all in the same shirts, all drinking in the same pub, all chanting the same songs. And there's just such a sense of group and belonging and identity that comes from this stage. So that's kind of how it looks in the world.
Yeah. The thing about this stage of development is that I am quite loath to stick my neck out and take risks and be seen as separate from the group. So, you know, that moment where as a leader, you say something like, who has some ideas on how we're going to solve this problem? And the group goes quiet. And no one wants to offer anything because no one wants to stick their necks out. And then after the meeting at the water cooler, everyone, or on the WhatsApp group these days in the virtual work environment, everyone's chatting and everyone has ideas and complaints about how the thing was discussed and why there weren't other ideas and share their ideas. And in the meeting, in the place of the opportunity to contribute, I don't stick my neck out and I defer to authority. At the conforming stage, I want my leaders to be good mommies and daddies that keep me safe. And so when leaders in some way create some disturbance to my world, like implement some change, then I feel that they're not keeping me safe anymore. And I can turn on authority fairly quickly.
The move to the next stage comes about where we see at the conforming stage that actually sometimes it's not rational just to follow the group. So when everyone's standing in the sun at midday, we kind of look and go, well, is that really a rational approach to this? Why don't I go and stand in the shade? That's more logical. And so this is where logic comes in. This is what we call the specializing phase, where 38% of adults sit.
Now, the specializing phase is the place where I believe that the best expert should be the leader. And so if you want to recognize this at work, it's, you know, when there's that part of the conversation where people saying, how can that person be the senior director? They can't even do my job. Now, the moment you get that kind of conversation going where the highest expert should be the highest authority, you know that there's a lot of specializing going on. Here, I'm paying attention to quantitative data. I'm not so much interested in qualitative things like intuition or feelings. I might feel that a lot of the work that we do around culture in government and this idea of caring is a waste of time because people should just get down to do the job. And there's really a firm opinion and a belief in things like meritocracy that is significant in the specializing stage.
I think I just want to make one point here around all these stages again. So all of these stages have beauty. All of these stages have value. to add. And so even at the opportunist, self-protecting stage, in emergencies, they're really, really good and really effective. The compliance of the conforming stage is really, really helpful in some organizational roles in certain contexts. And the rational view of the technician, the specializing person, again, is incredibly valuable in organizations and in life, actually. What we're saying is that this isn't the only worldview.
Yeah. So at the conforming stage, if I have a job in the call center, in one of the citizen-facing call centers where I need to follow a script, and there's a certain standard operating procedure that I need to follow day in and day out, this is a place where this is a very good use of someone who is at this stage. And Marco, I agree, hierarchy tends to breed conformity. And that fear that standing out is going to be career limiting. I've heard that so much in Western Cape government. I can't say that, I can't do that, it's going to be career limiting, is a kind of belief that can come from that desire to be in the group and to not stand out.
And certainly don't challenge the boss.
Certainly don't challenge the boss. Don't challenge the DG.
Absolutely.
In terms of the specializing phase, obviously, if we are working in certain roles, so for example, if we're working in water and sanitation in some kind of space where there's incredibly technical solutions that are required, if I'm working in the audit function and in supply chain where there's incredibly technical evaluation of information that forms part of making sure that we are a government that, that gets clean audits, then this is a place where I really want a significant part of my team to be. What we need to look at here is what are we going to miss out on, and what kinds of information might these technicians not be seeing?
And the answer is human intelligence and human information. So emotional information, relational information. And that's what brings the move to the next stage, is a realization that actually rational data alone is not going to be enough to make sense of the world, because there's much more going on out there. And so with every stage, our worldview is getting broader and broader. And at the performing level, so we're able to see not just rational information, but also emotional information too. This is a stage that is characterized by huge effectiveness and a sense of being in the slipstream of society, at the top of my game. And you can see here we've got Jack Welch in the corner there, who arguably was one of the people who believed he was at the top of the game most in the history of business. There is a real sense of being able to do anything, actually, and a responsibility level, which is huge. It's like I feel responsible for so much and so many people. So it's a stage which is characterized by outcomes, really, really making stuff happen in the world. There are one or two shadow parts of this, and that's that the level of responsibility sometimes is so great that it can lead to burnout. That idea that I can do anything and make anything happen can lead us to overextend ourselves. So there's definitely a watch out there. This is the stage where people often go off and they get coaches in organizations. So I want to grow and develop. I need feedback in order to grow. And so I actively solicit feedback. Up until this point, actually, feedback is a little bit dangerous, or it's going to, in some ways, affect adversely my worldview and my view of myself. Here, the performing people are actively seeking it out in order to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we see as well at this phase is this is the place where a real interest in developing my emotional intelligence becomes part of the landscape. It's the place where I'm starting to tip over from management into leadership, where I'm starting to accept and embrace my influence, my agency into the system. It's the place where when there's change coming, I'm saying, how can I be part of it? As opposed to, for example, at the conforming phase, I would say, are my leaders going to keep me safe and protect me? At the specializing phase, I'm saying, have the leaders that are driving this change thought about all the things they need to consider? Can we trust this change? Is this a rational decision? At the performing level, I'm saying, I'm part of the change. I'm willing to take responsibility for that. And this is the end of the conventional stages. And so as we get into the next stage, what we're tipping into is a place where we become slightly less like others as a way of thinking about post-conventional.
Bit more out of the system as well. Here we're hugely in the system at the performing level. And let's just reiterate the statistics here. So we've now covered where 80% of adults get to in their lives. So performing is the kind of last thrust of conventional success. And in our society today, arguably, this is held up as the finishing line. We want to be like Jack Welch. We want to be like people at the top of their game. What we're saying is there are 4 more levels. There are 4 more stages that humans can grow to. And there's huge value in that. So we trip over now into what we call the post-conventional levels of development. So less than 20% of adults get here. About 12% make it to this phase, which we call the internalizing stage. So here I'm operating much less off the conventional map of how to do life. And what comes much more into the fore here is our inner voice. So up until this point, maybe I've got to the top and I'm in the corner office and I'm CFO and I've been an accountant all my life. And that's what I wanted out of my career. And then there's this very quiet voice, which at the internalizing phase starts to get louder and louder, which says something like, but actually you really wanted to farm garlic in the Karoo. You never really wanted this. Your parents wanted this, but you didn't. And so that inner voice, that inner drive becomes much, much more prevalent at this stage, as do emotions. In fact, emotions are the primary way of making sense of the world at the internalizing stage. And individualism, individuality, where I start to do stuff that might be a little bit off the map as far as my family of origin and my upbringing were concerned. In fact, people start to look and go, I think she's gone mad. What's she doing now? She had that great job at Western Cape Government and now she's going off to be a farmer. What's going on? She's lost it. But actually, this is just about the inner world kicking in. And with that comes incredible access to creativity and innovation and diversity and inclusion and multiple perspectives. So the big gift here is multiple perspectives, actually.
Absolutely. Now, the trick is, when people start tripping into this place where I'm trying to make decisions about my life from an authentic place, it's very hard to keep them in a very hierarchical, structured organization such as the Western Cape Government. And so what happens is, as I get to that part of the mountain where I'm able to see multiple perspectives, I also wonder whether I should leave. And the less flexibility there is in the system around how I'm able to show up and contribute, the higher the chances that we lose people at this stage.
This is where people leave organizations, when the values inside don't square with the values outside.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting examples that, and I'm not 100% sure where we go with this, but Patrice Motsepe, if we think about him about 5 years ago, a lot of performing outcomes orientation going on. And now all of a sudden he's popping up and he's organizing concerts that that's going to end poverty and change the world. And he's doing stuff in the soccer world. And we're thinking, what's he up to? I mean, we thought he was a mining magnate. When did he get interested in soccer? So there's an example of someone who maybe has tripped over into some post-conventional ways of seeing the world. Not sure how far he's gone, but there's a great example.
And there can be a slight lostness about this stage as well. There's a sense of, well, my previous self has gone and the new one hasn't quite emerged yet. So we're not quite at strategizing level, but we're also out of the performing zone as well. It's like 1 foot in each camp. And it is a really, really heavily transitional phase in development.
Yeah. Our next phase, the strategizing or systems balancing phase, is really that place where I am now in a position on the mountain where I'm able to see patterns and I'm able to see the system for what it is. It's a place where we really want a lot of people who have strategic decision-making capability to be able to access on a regular basis. Now, I love the example of Shaka Zulu here. If you think about some of the contribution that Shaka Zulu made, and for a moment, we'll take some of his personal lifestyle choices and put that to the side, but think about the way in which he changed war forever. So on the mountain, he was able to see the cow horn formation. And that's something I can only do when I see the system as a whole. I can't see that when I'm in the battlefield or on the dance floor. I can only see this from the balcony. That idea of really shortening spears as being a way of being able to fight in certain circumstances. Another thing, I can see that from on the mountain. I can't see it when I'm on the dance floor.
I like Richard Branson actually as an exemplar of this stage as well. And, you know, if you watch some of the Branson interviews and he's asked about the secret of his success, he often answers things like, well, I just see patterns. I mean, even minimizing it by saying just seeing patterns, but the strategist can see stuff coming from far away. 6-12 months, they're seeing the patterns that are coming in and can be very agile around setting up for that future.
Yeah. So if you think about self-protecting, where we started being really about eating the sweets now, here at this phase, my capacity for complexity, my time frames that I'm operating within is really, we're starting to get to being able to see and work within 5-year time frameworks like you do in the Western Cape government in terms of your strategic plans. It's not just about what am I going to do this quarter or even this year. It's seeing where the longer trajectory is going. And that means that part of the decisions that I make might seem a little bit odd in the here and now, but then 3 years later, people look back and say, wow, that was really a wise thing that took us down a route that, as Letitia says, is really about true leadership, strategic leadership, long-term leadership, systemic leadership.
This is an immensely powerful stage, actually, and you want some of your very top leaders to be at this kind of level so that they can guide the organization in a long-term way. But of course, you've got to get through the internalizing phase. So the trick for organizations is to keep people at that previous stage of internalizing when actually they want to leave the organization. So the big challenge for organizations is how to create enough space and enough flexibility for somebody at an internalizing level to stay and still pursue some of the stuff that they want to pursue, but also support the organizational agenda. And then you get them at strategist. And that's where the real potency lies, actually, from a strategic and complexity perspective.
Yeah. And the shadow side of the strategist can be extreme arrogance. So let's also just say that. When I feel like I can lead as if the world's a chessboard, I can get dizzy with that sense of agency.
Yeah.
So the last phase we're going to discuss in detail is the transforming or the alchemist phase. This is really where it's no longer about what I am doing in the system, but who I am that makes the difference. So at the transforming phase, my belief is that who I am is the contribution. It's not about all these clever results that I have. And I know, having had the privilege of being in the room with people at this stage, it's the sense like everyone can think better and almost become better human beings because, and it's not some kind of magical presence, but it's really just this thing of like, there's an essence, a quality of being that is part of people at this stage. Sometimes this is also where people start operating between systems. Now, when Mandela did that thing in 1995, where he walked onto the rugby field wearing a Springbok jersey, walking between what at that stage was still very definitely separate white and black worlds. To some extent, some of that is still how our society operates today. But that idea of being able to, through who he is, start bringing some of those worlds together. That's what we're doing at this alchemist transformational phase.
The phrase that sums this stage up best for me, and let's not forget that very, very, very few people will make it here. That's the first point. So the phrase that sums this up for me is, it doesn't matter what happens to us. It's the meaning that we make of it. So these are master narrative weavers. These are storytellers of note who can construct reality, going back to that very early slide that we used, at will. So it doesn't matter what happens to me. It is the story I tell, the narrative I weave, the meaning I make from it. Okay, that was a very quick look at the model. There have been some fantastic points that have been made, not all of which we can refer to here, but we are going to capture them and look back on them, and maybe we can even publish them.
Yes, we will. This idea of fallback that we signposted earlier. So what happens to us is this kind of vertical journey that we're on is quite a fluid one. So we have moments where maybe we're able to access more of a strategizing way of showing up. And then there are moments when we fall back to earlier stages. Now, context has such a huge impact on this idea of fallback. And we cannot emphasize enough how big an impact the pandemic and the current context is having on our ability to be mature leaders. When we are tired and exhausted and burnt out and confused by everything that we need to hold, context, like gravity, pulls us into earlier stages, and we start making decisions from places that represent an earlier me as opposed to now. So one easy way to identify fallback, if you are a leader who is really interested in the value of care, and you really pride yourself on being attuned to where your people are at, and all of a sudden at the moment in your team meetings, you find that you've become 100% transactional, that you've lost your ability and your patience with people. And it's almost like, please don't tell me about another person in my team that's got COVID. Sorry, I can't handle it, even though care is important to me. This is an example of fallback, where I've become transactional, even though I know that I am more of a transformational leader.
And we've seen massive examples of this globally, actually, in the last 18 months, as Lucille says.
Yeah.
Gavin, what about being? We are going to provide a handout, and there'll be some stuff in there on being. We just see so few of those people that we thought we'd concentrate our time on where the volume lies in this model. But we will be sending out some further reading after this.
The shorthand on being is that people who are at the being stage of maturity are really interested in transcending all kinds of maps, even language, and ask questions like, how can I experience life directly without it being disintermediated by all these sense-making frameworks? Now, what I just said might make absolutely no sense to some of you, and that's okay. And that's how I feel when working with some of the being level 2. So there are very few people that are here, and they have a very different view on the world.
Good. Let's get practical around this stuff. Let's ask the so what question. How does this show up in my life? How can this be useful? First thing we want to do is send you off into a quick breakout group. Breakout groups. There will be a number of them. I think we're going to go in 3s or some 4s maybe. Yeah, 4s. And we're going to send you off with this case study. And this is a case study of John, who is at a particular level. And what we'd like you to do in those groups that you will find yourself in and find yourself invited to in a moment is just to look at the 3 questions there. So what we've done is we've posted this 1-page brief in the chat. So you've got access to it now. You can open it up as a PDF. Just pop off into your breakout groups. We're going to give you about 7 minutes. I think it's just a short kind of conversation to look at these 3 questions.
Yeah. If you can't see the document in the chat box, please take a screenshot of this. Control print screen should allow you to do that. And then you can just pop it into a document. But you'll see John is a public servant. He likes to be really rational. He's data driven. He's struggling at the moment with remote work. There are people in his team that are experiencing grief and loss, and he doesn't know how to deal with it. So your questions to discuss there: how might John's maturity be impacting on what he values and pays attention to? And how might it be impacting on what he's uncomfortable with and ignores? So that idea of our maturity makes us ignore some parts of the world. And what might the next step in his maturation be? So let's do
50.
Let's do that. Oh no, it
Maximum.
won't be on 50.
Okay. You're going to go into slightly bigger groups. We're going to assign you automatically. We are opening all the rooms, so you should now have an invitation to join a breakout group. There will be 6 or 7 maybe in there.
Yep, and we'll pull you back 10 minutes from now. Okay.
Okay.
Please join your breakouts.
Good morning.
Our suggestion would be, why don't we chat about these questions now in the big group?
Yeah. So we're going to invite you, we'll put the case study up again, and we're going to invite a couple of you to maybe just in the chat box, share your thoughts around this, and we'll read some of those thoughts out around John's case study. So first question, let's just stick to that first. How might John's maturity be impacting on what he values and pays attention to? And we just asking, Courtney, you're making pictures on the screen for all of us. I'll just see if I can clear all of that. But just take a read through this, and maybe we can have in the chat box a sense of how John's maturity is impacting on what he values and pays attention to, and maybe even his experience of the world right now.
What do you think? Okay, regressing. Okay. Traditional thinker, specialist. Good. What else? What other thoughts?
So Lionel's saying John sounds like he lacks confidence and he's easily overwhelmed. I think one of the things that's interesting, as Sharifa's saying he needs soft skills, not adapting to the changing circumstances, lacks EQ. And quite a few people starting to say it sounds like a little bit that he's in the specializing phase. So what kind of data would you be looking at in this case study, Simon, to help you understand the level of maturity that John is coming from?
I think I'd certainly have a focus on how emotional and how conversant emotionally. A lot of people talk about emotional intelligence in that traditional sense. So I'd be looking for that versus the more kind of rational, technical, numbers-driven view of the world. That'd be the first thing I'd be looking for. I think another thing around specializing people sometimes is flexibility or a lack of flexibility. And so my attention gets drawn a little bit to how John has adapted to COVID. Is there agility there? Can he find himself in different contexts and circumstances and roll with it? Or is there more of a reticence to deal with those kinds of changes and be flexible? If
we bring this back to the poll that we started the session with, one of the things that we might consider is whether we have been, so this is where you can now look inward a little bit. If your sense that leading and managing in a pandemic is more or less the same as, if not easier, just because people are maybe asking less of me because they're partially working from home. If your sense is that it's the same, now is the same as pre-pandemic, then part of what you struggle with might be similar to some of John's lack of adaptability. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the impact of John's maturity on what kinds of data he ignores or feels uncomfortable with. There's quite a lot there that he's ignoring. So he doesn't know how to process the grief and loss of his team member that's lost her husband. So that thing of like, okay, if I'm working with the budget, I know what to do with it. But when I'm working with humans, it's almost like, let's not go into that data too much. Yeah.
I think also, just to throw something in here, we can be very punitive of John. We can be quite critical of John. The thing to remember about the maturity framework, so this is our worldview. We can only see what we can see. And so here's where the imperative for self-development really comes in, because we limit ourselves actually around what we can see in the world. So we have to meet people where they are. John is where he is. He can see what he can see, and he can't see what he can't see. And so his response is not malicious. His response is actually just his worldview, because his worldview is this and not this.
Yeah. And so if we were to work with John, what our question would be is, so how do we help John see and value parts of the world that he can't see and value yet, rather than punishing or judging him for it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Simon, what might the next step in John's maturation be?
Well, I mean, a lot of people are pointing out it's about emotional intelligence. It's about developing his emotional capacity. And I think actually, to sum it up, that is a large part of the work that John might need to do, is to focus more on himself and focus more on emotions and focus more on what's going on inside of him. Now, that all sounds quite fluffy. But I think some kind of practices and some development work around enhancing self-awareness, understanding his impact as well. I think that a rational technical impact sometimes is experienced by humans as quite hard.
Yeah.
And so to get some level of self-awareness around how he's showing up in the world would be really, really important at this stage.
So there's this saying in the maturity work that says, what we can't see inside of ourselves, we can't manage or offer to the world outside. So if I can't engage with my own emotions, how am I going to engage with the emotions of others? And the thing around this is not a head thing. I can send John on 1 million training programs in which there are slides up that says Western Cape government is a place that cares, and humans are assets, and we need to be nice to people, in very base terms. And that might not make a difference at all, because the maturity work is not about understanding things in our heads, but taking head understanding into the rest of our beings, how we live our lives, how we approach everything that we do.
Yeah. The other trick that you might need to just work with John is to make a little bit of a rational argument in the first instance for getting him into the work that he needs to do. So you might need to say something like, well, did you know, John, that 72% of leaders who undertake coaching actually end up much more effective, or something like that. You make initially a kind of quite logical case for what is essentially emotional work. Because you've got to get the work in to start with. And there will be quite a defense sometimes around doing deeper, more emotional work.
Yeah, I love what Carmen's saying. Maybe part of the doorway in is for others to share their experience. And through that, help to get him into the work.
Good, some good stuff there. Just in terms of how this plays out in your context. And so what we know a couple of things. We know that the Western Cape government staff generally are sitting at a conforming and specialising level. There is some performing going on in the organisation. And the citizens that you serve are probably sitting at conforming and specialising as well. What we know from this work is that in order to serve most effectively a community or a group or an organisation, leadership needs to be ahead of or at a later level to the community that they're serving. And so this is what makes it so important. This is what the values-based leadership development program is set to instill within the organisation, is to mature the whole system in order to serve people better.
Yeah, and if you think about the Western Cape government strategy and some of the elements around the new ways of work, which has been mentioned there, I think, by Lionel in the chat as well, but also the strategy around transversely looking at certain strategic problems together. Just the capacity to do that says that we need a whole chunk of leaders to be able to work transversely. And for that, I actually need some of the strategizing levels of maturity. So the question we're sitting with here that the John example really brings to light is, can we just mature Western Cape government, this system, without maturing the people within it? And we'll see this where we're implementing new ways of work and, for example, new ways of working with data and trying to build real data capability in government. Can we just build data capability? Or in order for us to play inside the new data landscape, do we need to also mature the human beings that are part of the system? So all the new ways of work, being citizen-centric, can we just decree this? Can we just put procedures and policies in place for citizen centricity? Or is that also about a reframe of mindset, a new way of seeing that we need to instill in the individuals? So this is a very apt picture. And I think some of you as leaders maybe have felt this at times, where you feel like you're swimming against the shoal, swimming against the stream, saying, I'm trying to offer a more mature way of doing things, and I'm met by this mass of people who are acting like sheeples, maybe, as an example of that. And so part of what we need to do is we need to figure out ways of turning the shoal with us. And we do that by using snowball methodologies. That idea of, if I can mature one leader in a directorate and they support different ways of thinking and seeing in their staff who do the same to the next level and the next level, then we really develop the capacity to mature the people in the system as the system tries to embrace strategies that are more mature.
I just want to pick up on a couple of things in the chat box. So Charles, absolutely, you can measure maturity, and that's what we're busy doing actually in the Western Cape government system and in a number of other organizations. So we have a maturity assessment, which is a sentence completion test, which measures people's level of development. And then we can get a sense of where the individual is and also where the system is, and then what kind of interventions are going to be best for development and growth.
It's important to note that it's a very bad idea to think that you can do self-report measurements on maturity. We all think, and I'm going to say this for all of us, including us, think that we are more mature than we are in actual fact, in part because we have head knowledge of what some of the later stages might mean. And our lives, when you look at how we live our lives, might be at an earlier stage.
We, some of our life is spent as faculty in business schools, and we teach on MBA programs around the world. And one of the most glorious things to do with a new MBA group is to ask people to self-classify, and you'll find everybody moves to strategizing and transforming.
Absolutely. Even though they're 27-year-old,
So we
MBA
overestimate.
students.
We
Absolutely.
overestimate is the...
So let's get practical. How do we mature? And here we're going to put some of the technologies for supporting our own maturation into 3 boxes. The first box is heat experiences. We have to get into the frying pan, out of our comfort zones, and get into places where we are embracing uncomfortable ways of doing things, experimenting with new things, swimming against the stream, even though we might be afraid that some of it might be career limiting, and expose ourselves to things that make us uncomfortable. We need to rattle the cage a little bit. The second thing that's really helpful if we want to mature is we need to get into conversation with people who think and see differently to us. And we need to not take those differences personally. We need to get curious about them. We need to really expose ourselves to different perspectives and allow that collision to create new perspectives for us. And the third thing is we need to develop our capacity to be on the mountain or on the balcony instead of spending our entire lives on the dance floor. So that Shaka Zulu moment, we need to strengthen and develop a balcony that allows us to see more and more of the system. And then we have, this is like Lotto, the Powerball, the bonus ball says, anything you do to help your body become more healthy and well also helps to repattern your mind. So investment in your health and well-being and fitness also is the fourth category. We're not going to speak so much about that. So here we have some ideas of how to support our own and others' maturation. It's not a complete list, but we've basically given you 16 ideas of how to get started in terms of the maturation journey. In terms of heat experiences, as a leader, create safe enough psychological safety and encourage developmental risk-taking. So this would be where I make it okay and safe for people to not just follow the formula, for example, when presenting the achievements in our latest project, but allow them to maybe try and do something a little bit differently and support and make it safe for those developmental risks to take place. The second thing around heat experiences is very controversial. So just feel how uncomfortable this maybe makes you. This is why it's a heat experience. Imagine giving some tasks to the least qualified person in your team. The most qualified person to do that thing is probably not going to learn a thing from doing it. They've already done it a million times. It's part of their comfort zone. Whereas someone who's maybe very new to that part of the field might learn a lot. You've all benefited at some point in your career from people trusting you to do more than you thought that you could do. And that's really what's an important heat experience there. All kinds of action learning assignments. Those of you, there's a couple of you that are part of the Values-based Leadership Development program. You're busy with action learning projects that I'm sure make you really uncomfortable. This is deliberate. This is part of what helps you to mature. And then, of course, you can have heat experiences in workshops where you manufacture heat through the way in which you do things, through facilitated interventions that put people on the spot. In the Values-based Leadership program, there's a point where people go and they kind of in-frame on the stage and they get interviewed by their colleagues about their personal ways of seeing things. And that can be very uncomfortable. That's the kind of heat that afterwards I learn some things about myself just through how that is structured. In terms of colliding perspectives, doing things like the Kaidu program, citizen journeys, where you go and you spend time in the citizen's shoes, that brings you into relationship with this perspective of citizens, different ways of being in intergenerational or interfaith or interracial or interdepartmental dialogues where people have such a different worldview. And if we can remain curious, that's amazing. I mean, in the US at the moment, there's a whole movement to bring Republicans and Democrats into conversation with each other with psychological safety to try and break the impasse. There's an example of that kind of thing. And of course, you can try and work with polarity thinking in your own mind. In terms of your balcony perspective, strengthen your inner observer, mindfulness practices, known to do that. If you have a coach or a mentor that is further along in the journey than you, a late stage mentor, that's really helpful. Maybe some of you have benefited from people who are more strategic than you, mentoring you as an example. And so what this brings us to is if you are going to be creating heat experiences in your space to help yourself and your people to mature, know that it's not just about creating the heat without also making it safe. In the agile world, we know that we go through a sprint and then we do a retrospective to learn from it and say, what are we not going to do the same again when we do the next sprint? So it's disrupt and then contain, integrate, make safe, build psychological safety, do team development work. Because without the psychological safety, all you're doing is actually disrupting and breaking.
And then just to move towards the finish, just to, again, underline some of the benefits of this work. And so there's such a vast array of individual and systemic benefits to following maturity as a strategy for human development. So there's an enormous relational upside to this. So when we move beyond the specializing level and we start to engage with humans as opposed to humans as rational objects, then we can find that this is transformational for performance and transformational for well-being. of course, as we grow and develop and as our worldview gets wider and wider and broader and we take in more information, you can imagine the impact on things like strategic skills and strategy making capabilities. So the more data that we have access to, the more information that we can see in the world, the more complex and the more realistic and the more appropriate the strategies and the decisions that we make can be. And then I think there's a big thing around self-awareness. So as we mature, we see more of ourselves. We don't just think of ourselves as the good project manager. Actually, we think of ourselves in a much more fully human kind of way around our role as a parent and as a friend, as well as a project manager within the system. So we see much more of ourselves. We see much more of other people, the good and the bad and the indifferent, as I said earlier.
Yeah, and that's really important. We stop trying to be heroes that are all good. We are able to also recognize and integrate into who we are as leaders, those rough edges and the places where we are less than perfect. And we're able to say, there's some things that I suck at and I really failed in this too. I'm not always the hero saving everyone.
And then as we grow and develop, also we get a little bit kinder to ourselves. And I think this is really important, particularly in the last 18 months, but more generally, we see such an increased level of burnout in organizations at the moment. And I go back to the poll that we had earlier around exhaustion. And I think that was the #1 reported sentiment over the last time. So we've got to actually start looking after ourselves better. And as we relax the grip that some of our personality fixations have on us, so we find that we might start to value life outside of work a little bit more. So we get more relaxed, we start treating our families a bit better, we become better parents as well as better employees. So there's a huge upside around self-care and care for others by extension from maturity work.
Yeah, those of you on the values-based program, you'll hear what Simon's sentiments echo. Self-care is community care.
So a few final points. We think this is the game changer of human development. We are quite obsessively driven by this technology and we extol its virtues wherever we go. We really think that it's going to make a massive shift and is making massive shifts in the world. And in fact, it's an imperative because as we covered earlier, and as you'll know, the world is going faster and is more complex and volatile. And so we absolutely must develop the vertical development skills that we need to manage that kind of very complex environment. And I suppose the third thing is a call to action to every person on this call, is that we're not going to mature you. Nobody could mature you but you. And there was a beautiful comment earlier around, I think it was from Yassine, who said, actually, it's an openness that we need in terms of being open to mature. And that's the challenge, is to be open, because it's your individual responsibility actually to mature yourselves. And again, self-care is community care. That notion of fitting your own mask before helping others to fit theirs that we get briefed on every time we get on an aeroplane. And it's so true. We must mature ourselves first, and then we can support others to grow and mature.
So if this has piqued your interest, we will be sharing the deck. We will be sharing a white paper on the different stages in the maturity journey, as well as some stuff about the Banny world. Importantly, support the values-based leadership development program that is being run from the Department of the Premier. There is an email address that you will find in here if you want to find out more about the VBL program. And you can also speak to Aileen Cleet and Lynn September as people who are intricately involved in this, as is Johan. We thank you very much for your attention. We know many of you are going off to other meetings, and maybe Johan, from your side, anything that you'd like to say as we close out? We really loved being able to support all of you and to rattle maybe your cages and create some heat as you think about what maturity really means.
Lucille and Simon, thank you very much. I just want to thank you. I look at the comments and I see everybody saying that they've experienced tremendous value from this. And I think maybe just a last concluding comment. I like the snowball concept that you spoke about, and it also links to what Simon was saying. And I really just want to urge people to start with yourself and look at ways, speak to people that are on the values-based leadership development program, work with yourself and look at ways to find ways of maturing yourself in order to influence others. I like that concept of the snowball. If we want to change the system and improve the system, I think that's the best way to approach it. But in conclusion, Simon and Lucille, thank you very much. And yeah, just thank you for everybody who tuned in today, and appreciate your attendance. Thank you very much. Take care.